France. Autumn, 1944. Rain had fallen for 3 days straight. Roads turned to rivers of mud, tanks bogged down, and weary soldiers cursed every mile they had to walk. At the edge of a forest, beside the charred remains of a German convoy, stood a strange silhouette. A massive machine with 8 wheels and tracks. Not a truck, not quite a tank. Something that looked as if it had rolled out of a mad engineer's dream. "What in hell is that thing?" Sergeant Brown lifted his helmet to get a better look. "That," Mechanic Jenkins replied, "is why these guys lose wars. Too damn complicated." On its steel flanks, barely visible through mud, the faint outline of black crosses. And on the front plate, an emblem, Sd.Kfz 7. The Americans gathered around the monster. It was almost as long as a Sherman, its front a double-windowed cab, its rear an open bench for a gun crew, the back loaded with tools, chains, and crates. It looked alive, a sleeping iron animal waiting for orders that would never come. "Like a locomotive with wheels," one GI said. "Except you can't put it on rails, and you sure as hell can't fix it." Inside a metal box near the driver's seat, they found a maintenance log. Neat handwriting, signatures, oil pressure records, every line dripping with German precision. "These guys write more about oil changes than we write home," someone joked. Jenkins tried the hood. It took 3 men to lift it. Beneath, the Maybach HL62 Tuck engine, 6 cylinders, 140 horsepower of pure arrogance. "Holy smokes," Jenkins muttered. "That's not an engine. That's a cathedral." The Americans were used to simplicity. The M3 half-track, a machine you could repair with a hammer and a wire. But the German half-track looked like a symphony of metal. Levers, gauges, pumps, pipes, every piece carved to perfection, every bolt a declaration of pride. "They built it like they didn't trust their soldiers," said Lieutenant Miller. "You'd need a college degree just to start this damn thing." The next day, they decided to bring the beast to life. Corporal Hayes hooked up a Jeep battery. Jenkins found a tiny lever marked Anlassen. First turn, silence. Second, a cough, a tremor. Third, thunder. The Maybach roared to life, filling the air with a deep, growling rumble. "She lives," Jenkins shouted. The men cheered until they saw the fuel gauge. The needle didn't move. 5 minutes in, the engine had swallowed nearly a gallon. "You can almost hear it drinking," said Miller. They shifted into gear. The half-track lurched, groaned, and began to crawl. Tracks tore at the wet ground. Wheels rolled slow but steady. "Feels like driving a battleship on land," the driver said. "Smooth until you realize you're burning $1 every mile." On the dirt road, the Sd.Kfz 7 glided like a steel leviathan. Its weight gave it grace and crushed the road beneath it. 20 minutes later, the engine began to cough. Thick smoke billowed out. The cab filled with gasoline fumes. They stopped. Under the hood, oil and fuel leaking onto the ground. "Great," Jenkins sighed. "We just broke the Reich's best tractor." The culprit, the fuel system. A labyrinth of pipes and valves so intricate, no one could tell where it began. "If it takes 3 men and a manual to change a filter," said Miller, "it ain't built for war, it's built for engineers." That night, the lieutenant wrote in the after-action log, "Captured vehicle functions as designed, consumes excessive fuel, requires constant maintenance, unsuited for field conditions of Allied forces." Then in the margin he added by hand, "Beautiful machine. Terrible idea." Over dinner, Jenkins poked at his rations and said, "You know what this thing reminds me of? A Rolex that can't tell time when it rains." The men laughed. A tired, honest laugh. But there was respect in it. They knew what they were looking at. The pinnacle of craftsmanship built by people chasing perfection in a world that had no time left for it. That night, as the rain returned, the Sd.Kfz stood beside their fire, its armor glinting like wet stone. It looked almost alive, a monument to a nation that built ideals and forgot that war devours them. "They built it to last forever," said Miller quietly. "But forever runs out faster when you run on gas." The Americans called it the Beast, a machine too strong for the world that built it and too hungry for the army that needed it. France, November 1944. A frosty morning. Corporal Jenkins stood beside the German half-track, a tin mug of black coffee steaming in his hand, watching vapor rise from the Sd.Kfz's hood. "You think she'll start today?" asked Sergeant Brown. "She better," Jenkins muttered. "I've spent more time under her hood than I did with my first wife." The Americans had decided to use the captured Sd.Kfz to tow a damaged Sherman off the battlefield. The task: drag the tank out of a muddy field where it had sunk during the night bombardment. The mechanics filled the fuel tank, checked tire pressure and track tension. A soldier stared at the dashboard, a maze of dials and levers, every label in German. "Feels like I'm flying a damn spaceship." There were clockwork gauges, tiny red arrows, and so many knobs it looked more like a laboratory than a cab. To turn on the headlights, you had to flip 2 levers. To shift gears, you had to coordinate pedals in a sequence that could terrify an orchestra conductor. "You don't drive it," Jenkins said. "You negotiate with it." They hooked up the Sherman and connected the batteries. Jenkins turned the key. The engine groaned, coughed, and a cloud of grey smoke burst from the hood. The half-track roared to life, sounding like it had just woken up with a hangover. "She's alive. The Reich's last breath," Brown shouted. The motor shook violently, oil dripping onto the dirt, gasoline fumes so thick no one could stand near it for long. Jenkins slammed into first gear. The clutch screeched, and the machine began to move. Slow, steady, unstoppable. It was heavy, but it pulled the Sherman with surprising ease. The front wheels carved through the mud. The tracks bit deep into the ground. The half-track strained forward like a chained beast. "Pulls like a tank, but smells like a refinery," the driver said. A few minutes later, the work turned into a battle. The engine devoured fuel so fast that even the Sherman looked economical by comparison. "At this rate," Brown joked, "we'll need another convoy just to refuel the damn thing." The transmission had 12 gears plus reverse, an engineering masterpiece, but a nightmare to operate. The Americans, used to the simplicity of GMC trucks, struggled to keep the rhythm. One missed shift and the lever jammed. Jenkins slammed his fist on the panel. No wonder they lost. They spent all day shifting gears. When the road turned to swamp, the Sd.Kfz showed its real strength. It plowed through clay as if the mud didn't exist, tugging the Sherman behind like a toy wagon. The suspension absorbed every bump. The steering was smooth. Even the cab felt strangely comfortable. "Rides like a Cadillac," one soldier said. "Yeah," Brown answered, "except it drinks like 10 of them." After 2 hours, the engine began to choke. Oil temperature spiked. The machine wheezed to a halt in the middle of the road. They opened the hood. The stench of burned fuel hit them. Hoses trembled. The fan hissed. It was a mechanical drama, not a breakdown. "This thing doesn't just fail," Jenkins said. "It quits theatrically." They tried to restart it. Nothing. The mighty German machine, built to tow artillery and tanks, now needed to be towed itself. That night, they sat around the fire. The Sd.Kfz stood nearby, still warm, steam rising from its radiator. "You know," Brown said, "it's like the Germans made war a luxury sport." "And we made it a job," replied Miller. The men fell silent, listening to the fire crackle. Far away, artillery thundered in the dark. "You can tell who expected to win," someone said softly, "just by looking at what they built." The next morning, an engineering officer filed his report. "Captured German vehicle Sd.Kfz demonstrates remarkable traction and design precision. However, it consumes fuel at approximately 1.5 miles per gallon and overheats rapidly. Its complexity makes field maintenance impractical." At the bottom, he added in pencil, "A work of art that can't afford itself." The mission was a success. The Sherman was saved. But the lesson was clearer than ever. The Germans built machines to impress. The Americans built machines to endure. "They built monuments," Miller said. "We built tools." Between those two sentences lay the entire difference between their worlds. When the Sd.Kfz finally limped into base, its engine coughed, fuel tanks ran dry, oil black as tar. But the job was done. "Well," Jenkins said, wiping his hands, "it's the most beautiful disaster I ever drove." The Americans didn't just capture a vehicle. They captured an idea. That precision means nothing without purpose. Belgium, December 1944. A cold morning. The American repair crew had set up a temporary workshop inside an abandoned train depot. Ammo crates served as tables, coffee mugs steamed beside wrenches, and in the center of the hangar lay the half-dissected carcass of a German Sd.Kfz, sprawled open like a patient on an operating table. Someone had scrawled in chalk across its side panel, "Operation Autopsy." "We've taken apart Panthers and 109s, said Lieutenant Harris. "But this one feels like opening Beethoven's piano." The mechanics had stripped off the armored housing and loosened bolts stamped with the RZM emblem. Beneath it gleamed the Maybach HL62 TOC, a 700-kilogram masterpiece of steel and obsession, 6 cylinders, 140 horsepower, and so many pipes, valves, and fittings that the Americans stood in silence, just staring. "It's like they tried to make every part look important," said Sergeant Milton. "Even the damn screws are polished." Jenkins leaned in and sighed. "I've seen simpler coffee machines. Every component bore a mark, a date, a serial number, a factory code. Even the bolts were engraved with batch digits. The Germans hadn't just built machines, they'd signed their names on every molecule of metal." "That's the difference," Harris said quietly. "We build parts. They build monuments." When they lifted the cylinder head, the perfection stunned them. Valves machined so precisely they looked carved by a jeweler's hand, even compared to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in their own hangars. This looked too perfect. "They were scared of imperfection," Jenkins said. And that was the problem. The engine tolerated nothing. One wrong clearance, one grain of dirt, and the whole thing overheated. Harris studied the maze of oil lines. The lubrication system had 4 circuits, each with its own filter, each filter with its own valve, each valve with a spring fitted so precisely it seemed ceremonial. "If one of these breaks," Harris muttered, "the whole system dies, and you can't fix it in the field. You need a cathedral." American engines, by contrast, would simply burn oil and keep going. They weren't proud. They were practical. Corporal Richardson, who had been a mechanic back in Texas, found a half-burned German manual. schematics, charts, oil pressure tables, and a phrase on the title page, "Perfection ist Pflicht." Perfection is a duty. He turned the page and said softly, "And that's why they lost." The control panel was another sermon in over-engineering. 32 switches, 3 pedals, 7 levers, 1 for the clutch, 2 for the differential, and even 1 to manually tighten the tracks. "Ain't no soldier remembering all this under fire," said Milton. "You'd die before you finish starting the damn thing." They laughed, but it wasn't mockery. It was respect tinged with disbelief. This machine had been built on faith in intelligence, not faith in simplicity. To make the point, Harris ordered an M3 half-track brought next to it. Side by side, the difference was biblical. The German machine, precise as a Swiss watch; the American, crude, leaky, but alive. "Our half-track leaks, squeaks, and still runs," Jenkins said. "This thing leaks once and calls a priest." Replacing spark plugs on the M3 took 5 minutes. On the Sd.Kfz, it took more than an hour. To reach one plug, they had to dismantle half the hood. "If I had to fix this under artillery fire," said Milton, "I'd surrender to the nearest wrench." Later, the U.S. Engineer Corps filed its assessment. German Sd.Kfz 7 exhibits exceptional precision and craftsmanship. However, its complexity renders it unfit for sustained operations. It is a masterpiece without mercy. When evening light streamed through the broken windows, Harris sat beside the dismantled Maybach and spoke quietly, almost to himself. "They built like philosophers, but war rewards mechanics." That line would later be used in a documentary voiceover, the engine's hum still audible behind it. The Americans had learned their lesson. Their strength was in simplicity. Germany's was in pride, and between the two lay a gulf no horsepower could cross. "Perfection dies when it meets mud," said Jenkins. Under the hood of German pride lay the heart of a nation that forgot. Machines win battles, but simplicity wins wars. Luxembourg, January 1945. Snow and mud had turned the road into a grey slush. The supply convoy of the 3rd Armoured Division was lined up for departure. A dozen GMC trucks, a few M3 half-tracks, and one strange guest painted with white stars over faint, scratched-out German crosses. The captured Sd.Kfz 7, nicknamed by the men the German pig. "She eats more than a battalion," said Corporal Milton, tightening the straps on a fuel drum. The convoy rolled out at 6:30 a.m. Cold wind, frozen puddles, the metallic sting of exhaust. The American vehicles purred in rhythm, steady, predictable. But the Sd.Kfz Maven was different. Its engine's growl drowned out the rest, and its exhaust poured like smoke from a furnace, as if the machine itself was complaining in German. "She sounds like she's cursing us," joked Jenkins. For the first mile, everything went fine. The half-track moved smoothly, its sheer strength visible in every churn of the tracks. But 10 minutes later, the fuel gauge began to sink, fast. Lieutenant Harris was keeping a log. After 1 mile, 0.8 gallons gone. After 2, nearly 2 full gallons. Within 20 minutes, it had burned more fuel than an M3 used in a whole day. "At this rate," Harris said, "she's burning democracy by the barrel." They stopped at a bridge to check the tanks. The soldiers stared into the gauge, blinking in disbelief. "She doesn't run on gas," said Brown. "She runs on our patience." The Americans were used to precision. Every convoy had tight fuel math, strict schedules. The Sd.Kfz 7 broke every rule. Its 230-litre tank was dry after only 30 kilometers. Off-road, it drank fuel at less than 1.5 miles per gallon. worse than most tanks. We'd need a pipeline just to keep her moving, Milton muttered. As the convoy climbed a hill, they passed a standard M3 half-track. The driver waved and yelled, "How's the Kraut Cadillac?" Jenkins raised a thumb, then pointed at the fuel tank and shouted back, "Empty." Laughter rippled through the column. Even the officers grinned. 2 hours later, they stopped near a farmhouse. The Sd.Kfz had drained itself dry. The men rolled out barrels, pouring fuel through a funnel as the wind scattered the fumes. "She drinks faster than we can pour," Jenkins sighed. They added another 60 liters, enough for barely 15 more kilometers. That same day, a short note appeared in the U.S. engineer's log. Captured German vehicle Sd.Kfz attached to convoy A-17 requires continuous refueling support, not recommended for operational use. And in pencil, a dry comment below. Consumes gasoline like it's planning its own invasion. By afternoon, the road grew hilly again. The half-track strained up each rise, its engine roaring like a caged tiger. RPMs climbed, smoke thickened, and the temperature gauge crept toward red. "If she doesn't explode," Milton said, "I'll buy her a medal." Moments later, they halted. The motor had boiled over. Steam burst from the radiator like a geyser. "She's sweating arrogance," joked Brown. When the sun dipped below the hills, the convoy stopped for the night near a collapsed bridge. The Sd.Kfz stood in the middle of the road, its tracks sunk in mud, a puddle of oil and gasoline spreading beneath it. One soldier walked up, laid his hand on the cold armor, and said quietly, "You're a beautiful mistake." In the silence that followed, the machine seemed almost alive. Metal ticking softly as it cooled, like a creature refusing to admit defeat. The next morning, Harris wrote his final entry. The Sd.Kfz demonstrates unmatched traction and craftsmanship. However, operational cost exceeds practicality. Its value is symbolic, not functional. That line would later appear in the official report under code R21-45. By the time the convoy reached base, the German pig rolled to a stop by the fuel depot. 82 kilometers traveled, 350 liters of gasoline burned. "We could have flown there," Milton said. Harris looked at the mud-covered beast and replied, "They built power with no plan for distance." The machine sat still, as if exhausted by its own brilliance. The soldiers wiped off the painted stars and wrote across the hood in white paint, "A road too expensive." The Americans didn't hate it. They pitied it, a monument to brilliance too heavy for the world that made it. February 1945. On the outskirts of a small German village, the Americans had found shelter for their vehicles. A barn roof patched with tin, mud frozen into ridges beneath their boots. And under that roof stood the same Sd.Kfz, caked in dirt, silent but still imposing. The convoy was over, the fuel gone, and for the first time in weeks, the engineers had time to truly study the beast. Lieutenant Harris said quietly, "We've seen how it drives. Now let's see how it thinks." When Jenkins opened the door, it shut behind him with a soft, luxurious thunk. Not the slam of an American truck, but the muffled closure of a limousine. Inside, wide leather seats, still springy, not sagged, not torn. Even after months of war, they looked like they had rolled off the line yesterday. "Hell," said Milton, running his hand along the stitching. "This thing's more comfortable than my bunk." In front of the driver stretched a panel of instruments with more dials than a B-17 cockpit. Oil pressure, water temperature, fuel level, electrical charge, brake pressure, each labeled in Gothic script. Every lamp had its own color, every lever its own purpose. "It's a cockpit on wheels," Harris murmured. "Yeah," Jenkins replied, "and just as confusing." The floor was covered with embossed aluminum plates for grip. Pedals were cast metal, engraved with Kupplung, Bremse, gas. Even the gear lever gleamed like it had been polished for inspection. "They built it like they knew someone would admire it one day," Harris said. Then they noticed something unbelievable. The steering wheel was heated by a line from the exhaust manifold. They tested it. It worked. "They heated the damn steering wheel," Milton exhaled. "We can't even keep our coffee warm." Behind the driver were folding seats for the crew, each with its own shock absorber. Underneath, lockers for tools, rations, and a first aid kit. On the side walls, mounts for maps, lamps, spare fuses. On the ceiling, a hand-cranked ventilation fan, driven by a pulley and cable. The machine breathed discipline, even in its smallest details. "They made it for men who expected to come back," Harris said softly. The Americans compared it to their own M3 half-track. In theirs, hard benches, scorched metal, no heat, no holders, no comfort. "We build to win," Milton said. "They build to be remembered." Both men fell silent. They knew which philosophy had won, but the other still demanded respect. Jenkins climbed into the driver's seat. He turned on the ignition, checked each gauge in sequence. Every action required focus. Fuel pump on, preheat, starter engage. "It's not driving," he said. "It's conducting a symphony." When the engine finally rumbled to life, the whole cabin vibrated, but gently. Even the shaking felt disciplined, as if the machine refused to lose its composure. Yet the ergonomics were odd. The gear lever too close to the brake, the gas pedal set too high. To press it, you had to hold your foot at an angle. "They designed this for a ballerina," Milton muttered. The mirrors, too, were set for someone tall, uncomfortably so. "I swear, they made it for parade photos, not for roads." Under one seat, they found a small metal case. Inside, folded cloths, wrenches, and a soft brush for polishing the instrument panel. Etched on the lid were the words, "Sauberkeit ist Disziplin." Cleanliness is discipline. They really did worship order, Harris said. When the inspection was done, Harris opened his logbook and wrote, "The vehicle demonstrates exceptional ergonomic thought. However, every feature prioritizes pride over practicality. It is an engineer's dream, but a soldier's burden." Then, in a pencil, he added, "It's a chair made for kings, placed in a trench." Later that evening, by the campfire, the men spoke quietly, the glow reflecting in the snow. "You think maybe that's why they built like this?" Jenkins asked. "To remind themselves they were still civilized?" Harris nodded. "Maybe. But war doesn't care how comfortable you are, just how far you can go before you run out of gas." The Sd.Kfz 7 stood in the shadows, its windows reflecting the firelight. It looked strangely peaceful, like a home on wheels that no one would ever live in again. "It's the most human machine I've ever seen," Milton said, "and the least practical." Inside the German half-track was the story of a nation that built machines for pride and forgot that war has no patience for beauty. March 1945. U.S. Army engineers proving ground near Metz. The air was dry, the sky clear, and the smell of diesel and dust hung in the wind. On the test pad stood two machines side by side, a captured German Sd.Kfz 7 and the trusty American M3 half-track. On a crate between them lay a fuel logbook, measuring cans, and a stopwatch. Lieutenant Harris flicked ash from his cigarette and said, "Gentlemen, today we find out how much pride costs per mile." Jenkins checked the oil and fuel levels. The Sd.Kfz was filled to exactly 60 gallons of gasoline. The M3, 45. Both tanks brimmed. Extra fuel drums stood in a neat row on the ground. Sergeant Milton lifted the Maybach HL-62's hood, wiped his hands on a rag, and smirked. You can smell the arrogance. The contrast was striking. The American half-track, dirty, dented, functional. The German, gleaming, meticulous, almost theatrical. The vehicles lined up side by side. The course, a 20-kilometer loop to be driven twice. Engines roared, flags dropped, and the race of philosophies began. The Sd.Kfz rolled forward like a heavyweight boxer, smooth but ponderous. The M3 leapt ahead, rattling and coughing but determined. After 5 kilometers, black smoke curled from the German's exhaust. At 10, the fuel gauge began to dive. She's drinking like she just won the war, Milton said. When the first loop ended, both vehicles halted. Engineers recorded the numbers. The results spoke louder than any shell burst. Vehicle distance fuel used, average efficiency, M3 half-track, 20 km 4.2 gal, 4.7 mpg to Kfz 20 km 11.8 gal, 1.7 mpg. That's not consumption, Jenkins muttered. That's gluttony. They ran a second trial, this time without the Sd.Kfz-7's trailer. The difference was negligible. At nearly half a gallon per kilometer, its thirst was beyond reason. At this rate, Harris noted, we could heat an entire barracks with the fumes. He pulled out his efficiency tables. The Maybach engine's thermal yield was about 18%. The American White 160AX, 23%. On paper, the gap looked small. On the battlefield, it was the difference between advance and collapse. Theirs is art, Harris said. Ours is arithmetic. The Maybach delivered power beautifully, but demanded constant feeding. A concert pianist of machinery that refused to play in the mud. The Americans knew fuel was the blood of war. Every gallon counted. And now they saw why Germany was bleeding out. You can't win a modern war, Milton said, when your machines eat faster than your factories feed. Harris nodded. Every liter they burn is one less kilometer they can retreat. The field report read, the German Sd.Kfz provides exceptional torque and traction, but fuel efficiency is critically low. At 1.7 mpg, sustained operations would require a dedicated convoy of tankers, vehicle deemed tactically unviable for Allied use. And beneath it, a handwritten line, built to move mountains, stopped by gallons. When the results reached headquarters, engineers laughed, but with respect. They built a tractor that could pull a tank, one said. Too bad it needed its own refinery. That evening, Harris wrote in his notebook, every bolt, every weld in this vehicle screams perfection, yet it's trapped by the one thing engineers always forget. The world runs on logistics, not admiration. At dusk, the two machines rested side by side. The M3 looked weary, utilitarian. The Sd.Kfz looked proud and defeated, as if it finally understood its own tragedy. Milton tapped its fuel tank. You're too good for this world, buddy, Harris replied, or maybe just too thirsty. The men wiped off the last of the German emblems and scrawled across its side in chalk, the fuel problem. It became a running joke in the division. Whenever someone complained about mileage, they'd hear, could be worse, could be the German pig. In war, power means nothing without endurance. The Germans built engines of pride. The Americans built engines that lasted long enough to come home. April 1945. Former German Technical Center near Bonn, now under control of the U.S. Army engineers. The air smelled of dust, oil, and surrender. Inside the hangar, stacks of wooden crates scattered blueprints and burned pages stamped Kraftfahrzeugwesen here. At the center of a long table lay a folder marked Sd.Kfz 7, Konstruktionsunterlagen. Lieutenant Harris ran his finger over the soot-stained paper. They didn't just build machines, he said. They built philosophies. Inside the folder were dozens of hand-drawn diagrams, each signed by a German engineer. Precision sketches of lubrication systems, gear torque formulas, handwritten notes on tolerances. At the bottom of every page, Genauigkeit ist Sieg. Precision is victory. They believed enough bolts could hold back chaos, Jenkins murmured. The Americans had never drawn blueprints like these. Their factories ran on mass production, where 1,000 workers could build 1,000 interchangeable parts. German engineering, by contrast, was a living organism, every part dependent on another, each failure fatal. Harris scribbled in his notebook, "If one part fails, the rest commits suicide." Near the stripped-down Maybach engine, Milton held up a glimmering bolt. "You see this? Heat-treated, etched, serialized." "You know what we use back home?" Richardson replied. "A bolt." They laughed, softly, respectfully, because the truth was clear. The Germans had built perfection for the wrong world. In a drawer nearby, they found a journal belonging to a German designer. The ink was faded, but the words were intact. "Every deviation is betrayal. The machine must be perfect, or the man is unworthy." Harris read it aloud, then whispered, "That's the difference. We forgive mistakes. They execute them." On the wall hung 2 photographs, one of the Sd.Kfz, one of the M3 half-track, each the reflection of its maker's soul. "Theirs is obsession," Harris said. "Ours is curiosity." And that curiosity, not pride, was what had carried America forward. The ability to tinker, to try, to fail, and keep moving. "The Germans built violins," said Jenkins. "We built harmonicas, and the battlefield played our tune." That day, Harris typed the conclusion for his technical report. German over-engineering leads to exponential maintenance complexity. Systems optimized for control fail in chaos. Simplicity equals survivability. This line would later appear in official doctrine as the law of simplicity. Harris closed the folder and said quietly, "They lost because they never trusted the average man. Every bolt expected genius to tighten it." And that was the truth. Germany had believed in engineers. America had believed in mechanics. That evening, the officers gathered around a small oil stove. Someone poured weak coffee into tin cups. The war was ending, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to wonder what came next. "They'll rebuild faster than anyone," Harris said. "People who worship precision never stop learning. I just hope they learn mercy for imperfection." Later that night, Harris wrote a letter to his brother, also an engineer, back in Ohio. "I've seen the finest machine ever built. It broke down halfway to victory. Maybe that's what war really is, a test of who can make do with less." The Americans decided to fully disassemble one component, the brake cylinder of the Sd.Kfz 7. It contained 37 precision parts. The same mechanism in the M3 used 12. "That's over-engineering in numbers," Jenkins said. 3 times smarter, 5 times slower. Harris jotted one last note. "Perfection is a cage. Simplicity is freedom." Someone scrawled on the hangar wall in chalk, "It runs perfectly, until it doesn't." The phrase became a running joke among the engineers. In the final report, the summary read, "The German Sd.Kfz 11 is a triumph of precision and a failure of purpose. It represents the paradox of a nation that could design for eternity, but not for Tuesday. And at the bottom, a single line in pencil. From every bolt of the German half-track, the Americans learned the same lesson, that strength built without forgiveness always breaks under its own weight. May 1945. Germany had surrendered. The guns were silent. On a former Luftwaffe airfield near Dresden, the Americans had set up a temporary depot. Between shattered planes and burned-out trucks stood one weathered Sd.Kfz 27, its faded armor now painted with a white star and a new label in crude brushstrokes. The German pig. It was no longer a half-track. It was a mascot. Someone had left a coffee can on its hood. Someone else hung a helmet from the mirror. Across the side, in chalk, someone had added, "Drinks like a general, works like a private." "Hell, she's part of the team now," Jenkins said, sitting on the armor. Every day the pig gained new decorations, cartoon eyes on the bumper, a cigarette drawn between its fanged grill and across the hood. "Please feed daily." If the Krauts saw this, they'd faint, Milton laughed. Good thing they surrendered. Every unit had its mascot, but none had one quite like this. The Sd.Kfz-7 had become legend. Soldiers wrote home about it, posed for photos beside it, told stories around the fire. "They built it to pull tanks," Jenkins would say. "We use it to pull morale." At night, when campfires burned low, stories about the German pig took on a life of their own. Some claimed it drank gasoline, even while asleep. Others swore its engine could still be heard in Berlin, and one insisted it once refused a wash, out of pride. "She doesn't like water," Milton joked. "Reminds her of defeat." Harris watched the laughter and wrote in his notebook. Admiration turned into irony. What was once feared now fuels laughter. That's victory, not destruction, but transformation. A week later, the division held a small victory parade. The Sd.Kfz rolled into the square, draped in the American flag, its side chalked with a new nickname, Berlin Taxi. The crowd cheered. The machine that once pulled artillery now hauled mail and food crates. "From terror to grocery truck," Jenkins said. "That's progress." Later, they converted it into a field kitchen, a stove bolted into the bed, supplies stacked where shells once lay. Now it fed the men who once feared it. "Guess she finally learned efficiency," Milton grinned, watching the cook rest a pot right on the track. Harris noted the shift. The laughter wasn't cruel. It was healing. It mocked not the enemy, but the arrogance of taking machines or wars too seriously. "That's the secret of America," he said. "We laugh at what we conquer, and that keeps us human." Army photographers came to capture the mascot. One image appeared in stars and stripes with the caption, "Captured German tractor, still hungry, but now on our side." Even London newspapers picked it up, adding, "Consumes fuel, morale, and enemy pride." One afternoon, Harris turned to Jenkins and said, "You realize 6 months ago, this thing was towing 88s at Normandy. Now it's towing lunch." Jenkins smiled. "Yeah, that's what happens when genius meets common sense." The Sd.Kfz had become a metaphor, a relic of how perfection loses to simplicity. On a hangar wall, Harris scrawled a final line of chalk. "Complicated loses wars, simple wins them." In a letter home to his sister, Harris wrote, "We joke about it now, but I think we all feel a bit sorry for it. It's beautiful, proud, and useless, just like the country that made it." When orders came to relocate, fuel was short, and no one volunteered to tow the beast. They left it there, the pig, abandoned, but strangely dignified. Someone taped a note to the hood. "Gone, but still expensive." That evening, Harris passed it one last time. He rested his hand on its cold armor and whispered, "You were too good for this war." He stepped away as the camera panned back. The Sd.Kfz 7, standing alone in the rain, silent, proud, and utterly still. War takes power, and laughter gives it back. The Americans didn't destroy the German machine. They turned it into a story. June 1945. The front was silent now. The wind had replaced gunfire, and the fog had taken the place of smoke. On an abandoned airfield near Leipzig, one machine stood alone, once a symbol of German engineering pride, now a monument to the futility of over-precision. The Sd.Kfz 7 stood motionless. Mud had dried on its tracks, rust had eaten into its bolts, and the white stars painted over the black crosses had faded beneath the rain. After the unit withdrew, no one quite knew what to do with it. It wasn't written off, and it wasn't salvaged. It was simply left behind. Too heavy to move, too proud to scrap, Sergeant Brown said, as he drove off with the last convoy. The machine stayed behind to guard the emptiness. Passing soldiers recognized it from a distance. Some smiled, some nodded in silence. To them, it was more than a trophy. It had become a witness. She saw everything, Jenkins said before leaving. From fear to laughter. Now only the wind moved around it. Sometimes the metal creaked. Sometimes, when it rained, the tracks made a faint sound, like footsteps on wet stones. If you listened closely, you could almost hear the echoes, the laughter of soldiers, the roar of the Maybach, the crackle of distant fires. "Iron remembers," Harris had said before he left. A month later, a staff order came down, old captured vehicles to be dismantled. But no one touched the Sd.Kfz 207. Its engine was dead, but its presence was too grand to melt down. Engineers from the Ordnance Corps arrived, snapped photographs, and filed a note in their report. Vehicle Sd.Kfz 107, left in situ as example of German engineering philosophy. Condition: inoperable. Aesthetic: exceptional. One afternoon, a group of German civilians arrived, former Maybach engineers from a nearby town. They stood in silence before the machine. One removed his cap, another brushed a hand across the cold metal. "We built her to last 1,000 years, an old man said. She lasted 6. They walked away, and the wind erased their footprints. By autumn, tall grass had grown through the cracks of the runway. Birds nested inside the cab. The paint peeled away, but the words, "A road too expensive," were still visible on the side. Children from a nearby village sometimes came to play. To them, it was just a giant tractor from another world. "Papa, did the Americans build it?" a boy asked. "No," the father replied. "They survived it." By the winter of 1946, the airfield was abandoned completely. The Sd.Kfz 7 stood half buried in snow while new jet aircraft thundered overhead, sleek, fast, loud, the sound of a different age. It seemed frozen in time, a survivor of a civilization that had engineered its own downfall. If machines could think, perhaps it would have been proud. It didn't know it had lost. It only knew how to endure. Still perfectly built, still utterly impractical. "Perfection doesn't die," Harris wrote later in his notes. "It just rusts." Years later, the photograph of that same machine appeared in a U.S. Army Ordnance Department report. The caption read, "Sd.Kfz 7, captured vehicle, example of advanced yet impractical design. Demonstrates limits of precision under combat conditions." That phrase would echo through technical journals and history books for decades. For the soldiers who once drove it, it remained a joke. For the engineers who studied it, a warning. It was the most beautiful waste of steel we ever saw, Milton said years later. When the sun set over the overgrown runway, its rays glinted off the cracked paint, and for a moment, it almost looked alive again. Only now it towed not guns, but memory, heavy, quiet, and necessary. War ends. Men go home, but the machines remain. Silent monuments to everything we thought would last forever. July 1945. Ludwigshafen, the industrial heart of Germany. Silent, broken, still breathing smoke. American engineers walked through the ruins of the Maybach works, where engines for tanks, aircraft, and half-tracks had once been born. On a cracked wall, still blackened by fire, a slogan in faded paint remained. Technik ist Ehre. Engineering is honor. They really believed that, Harris said, running his soot-stained hand across the wall. Beneath their boots lay shattered machine tools, and on the floor, perfect, unused gears, gleaming even in the dust. Pieces built to last forever, until history decided forever was 6 years long. They built for eternity, Jenkins murmured, and got 6 years out of it. In a corner, they found an old German man, a former Maybach engineer. He sat at a desk with a small model engine before him, his hands motionless. Without looking up, he asked in careful English, "Did you come to learn, or to laugh?" Harris answered, "To understand." The man nodded slowly. "Then write this down," he said. "We built machines to prove we were still gods, and forgot we were men." Harris did. In his notebook he wrote, "Even defeat can be engineered beautifully." After the war, the US Army began cataloging every piece of German machinery. From the blueprints of the Sd.Kfz they extracted dozens of ideas, new braking systems, cooling designs, and weight distribution principles. The irony was sharp. The machine that symbolized failure became a seed for the future. "Every failed idea becomes a lesson," Harris wrote. Within a few years, engineers at General Motors and White Motor Company integrated Maybach concepts into new half-track designs, and the balance formulas developed in Germany found their way into American heavy vehicle standards. "Even perfection leaves scraps worth keeping," Milton said. The American engineers returned home changed. They no longer mocked German obsession with detail. They saw now that it wasn't vanity. It was faith, a belief that the world could be made orderly if only every bolt fit perfectly. They lost the war, Harris wrote, but they won respect. In 1946, back in California, Harris began teaching engineering. On the first day of class, he wrote on the board, "Perfection is beautiful until you need it to move." The phrase became famous, reprinted in engineering manuals, and later cited by NASA during the 1960s. In 1948, a restored Sd.Kfz was installed in the Aberdeen Proving Ground Museum. The plaque read, "Captured German half-track, precision beyond necessity, power beyond purpose." Visitors stood silently before it, some in awe, some in quiet regret. "They built this to conquer," said the guide. "Instead, it taught us how to build better." By the 1950s, former German engineers, once prisoners, now civilians, worked for Mercedes, MAN, and other companies. The same principles born in war now shaped trucks, diesel engines, and harvesters. The Sd.Kfz had become a paradox, a weapon that helped rebuild. "War doesn't destroy ideas," Harris told a student. "It just redistributes them." And so it did. Even defeat carried knowledge forward. In 1965, Harris received a letter from Hamburg. It came from one of the old Maybach men. It said simply, "I read your paper. You were right. The war taught us nothing about victory, but everything about limits. 20 years after the war, the Sd.Kfz stood in the museum, covered in dust. Next to it hung a wartime photograph, American soldiers laughing beside the same machine. The caption read, "Captured, studied, understood." In a 1970 interview, Harris reflected, "I used to think we beat Germany with numbers. Now I know we beat them with humility. They built machines to impress history. We built ours to survive it." The museum lights dimmed for the night. The camera moved slowly through the hall, rows of tanks, guns, and vehicles fading into shadow. At the center stood the Sd.Kfz, still whole, still magnificent. The glass reflected a glint of light as if the engine were about to start again. Machines don't choose sides. They reflect the hands that built them. The Sd.Kfz began as an emblem of domination and ended as a teacher. In its gears lies a reminder that even perfection must one day serve something greater than itself.